who has the distinction. Everyone could move to their tables, or if you want to continue your conversation, move out to the hallway. Our speaker for lunch is Bishop Julian Dobbs, who has the distinction of being our only New Zealander speaker today, so you know it's going to be unique. He is a missionary bishop for the Convocation of Anglicans in North America, which is sort of a joint project of the Church of Nigeria and the Anglican Church in North America. And he's also a diocesan bishop of the missionary diocese of Cana East, which is a diocese of the Anglican Church in North America. And part of his bishoply responsibilities include teaching on Christian-Muslim relations. And he became a naturalized U.S. citizen just last year. Julian is an old friend, and I just read to you from the Wikipedia official biography of him. Wikipedia does not mention his more eccentric characteristics. For example, he is wearing purple socks today, indicating just how Anglican and how bishop he is in his bearing. But I knew Julian was especially unique back when I first met him, and he mentioned casually as a Anglican priest back in New Zealand, he had displayed the Israeli flag at his church, sparking an interesting reaction there in New Zealand. So Julian has never been shy about waving the flag of his convictions, and he will be sharing more about that with you right now. So thank you so much, Bishop Dobbs.
Mark, thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's good to be with you. As you can tell, as Mark said, by my strong North American accent, I don't originally hail from these parts, but proud to call myself a new American citizen. I've been tasked to speak to you during lunch. I hope my talk won't go on too long so that it becomes after lunch, because after lunch is even harder. But Mark has asked me to speak on why I defend and support Israel as an Anglican bishop, and I'm honored and very pleased to do so. Christian Zionists are often charged with being politically dangerous, supporting and occupying oppressor in the Middle East and threatening world peace. They are also said to be theologically heretical. On the one hand, they teach the very opposite of replacement theology. On the other hand, the Zionist conviction that God has brought Israel back to their own land in our day has become entangled with dispensational theology and often with political activism. So, how then is it that an Anglican bishop, and I'm not the only Anglican bishop here, and numbers of my colleagues, such as Bishop Labar, who's smiling sweetly at me at the moment, in Episcopal orders, how is it that he and I and others with us defend and support Israel in 2015? One of the great strengths of the Anglican Church, expressed through membership of the 77 million member global Anglican Communion, is the diversity of its Christian membership. With foundations in the 16th century English Reformation, Anglicans have been among the champions of numerous global movements that continue to impact our world today. Wilberforce, Christian abolitionist, reformer and statesman; Florence Nightingale, nurse, social reformer; what of John Wesley, Charles Simeon, John Newton, all Anglicans or Anglican connected. And in our own nation, of course, George Washington, John Jay, James Madison, and a great man who shares a wonderful name, Richard Dobbs Speight, all signers of the Constitution, Speight, a signer of the Constitution, who have impacted their own immediate situations and influenced global movements from theological reform to childcare to the abolition of slavery and the availability of education. Wonderful Anglican engagement in the world. However, when the Anglican Church comes to discuss Israel, her past, present, and future, there appears to be a consistent theological, social, and political hostility towards Israel, the Jewish people, their religion, and their state. Dr. George Carey, the 103rd Archbishop of Canterbury in office from 1991 to 2002, became the first Archbishop of Canterbury in 150 years to decline to be the patron of the Anglican Church's ministry among the Jewish people. Reports at the time confirmed that the Archbishop, the most senior figure in the Anglican Church, did not wish to endorse the organization's missionary work, which he felt was damaging to interfaith relations. His successor, Dr. Rowan Williams, the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury, faced a torrent of criticism for the ill-judged decision of the Church of England's General Synod in 2006 to back divestment from a US company that made giant bulldozers used by the Israeli army. And then what of outspoken Anglican priest, the Reverend Stephen Sizer, who appears to have made attacking Christian support for Israel one of the central focuses of his ministry. Ironically, he comes not from the church's left wing, but from its evangelical membership. Sizer has said, and I quote, "In its worst forms, Christian Zionism uses the Bible to justify racial superiority, land expropriation, home demolitions, colonial settlements, the denial of international law, and the dehumanization of Arabs." End of quote. In 2007, Sizer spoke in Iran about Christian Zionism in 8 Iranian schools and was interviewed on Iranian television, radio, and in newspapers about Christian Zionism's, quote, destructive influence. Here in the United States, the Episcopal Church has approximately 2 million members, some 7,000, perhaps a few less churches. And because of its presence here in the United States, the relative wealth of its membership, and its connections to Anglicans throughout the world, the Episcopal Church is in a strategic position to influence attitudes towards Israel on both a national and global scale. Sadly, the Episcopal Church's leaders and constitutive bodies routinely issue one-sided statements about Arab-Israeli conflicts, and its publications portray Israel as exclusively responsible for violence in the region. Both the General Convention of that church and the Executive Council have exhibited a marked tendency to hold Israel to a utopian standard of conduct and its adversaries to no standard at all. For example, in November 1994, the Executive Council approved a resolution asking Motorola Company to, and I quote, establish a policy to prohibit the sale of products or provision of services to any settlement, including persons residing in those settlements located in occupied territories. This resolution passed 1 month after 2 Hamas suicide bombings had killed 13 Israelis and wounded a further 80. In June 1995, the same Executive Council passed a resolution asserting that Jerusalem should be a shared city, ignoring decades of Palestinian aggression against Israel that makes such an arrangement considered by many untenable. Or what of July 2000, when the General Convention approved a resolution affirming the right of return for every Palestinian, as well as the restitution for the loss as called for by the United Nations? You see, while passing these politically charged resolutions, the Episcopal Church is silent. It's silent, and nor has there been any resolution calling upon Hamas to dismantle terrorist infrastructure, and there is only silence about anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hate-mongering in mosques, in the media, and in children's textbooks. All of these circumstances and generations of anti-Israel positioning, both theologically, politically, and socially, have led many, perhaps most members of Anglican churches in the West to believe that in order to be a legitimate Anglican in the 21st century, one must oppose the Jewish people, their state and religion on almost every level. How then can Bishop Neil and I and others like us, bishops of the Anglican Church, support and defend Israel against such a background? For when a more comprehensive and thorough examination is made of the Anglican Church, her theology, history, involvement both socially and religiously, past and present, with the Jewish people, and obviously more latterly with the state of Israel, another position emerges, one that is less regularly articulated publicly and not widely known, yet a position that is embraced by thousands upon thousands of faithful Anglican Christians across the globe. And so I want to articulate what I consider to be that position from my own perspective, from four insights: from historical support, biblical support, moral support, and personal support. Let's look firstly at historical support. 200 years ago, the Bible itself profoundly affected a man named Joseph Fry, a Jewish believer in Jesus, the Messiah, who became the founder of the Anglican Church's ministry among the Jewish people. In 2009, the Church's ministry among the Jews, CMJ, an Anglican mission, celebrated its 200th anniversary. Although not the first evangelical Christian organization founded to serve the Jewish people, CMJ claims to be the longest standing. During those 200 years, CMJ witnessed every major historical event in Europe and the Middle East and remained supportive of God's people. They experienced every crisis that the Jewish people encountered, and yet the Church's ministry among the Jewish people and Anglican ministry continues to believe that God has not yet finished with his people Israel and their Anglicans. The founders of CMJ were influenced much by the Protestant reformers, and especially by the 16th and 17th century Puritans, who believed that God had not revoked his covenant love for the Jewish people. And from the beginning, CMJ was aware that God had promised to bring Israel back to her God, Messiah, and land. And seeing the oppression and persecution of the Jewish people, Anglicans in CMJ began developing a ministry of relieving the suffering of Jewish people through charity at local levels, political activism in the highest echelons, particularly of the British government, and proclaiming the gospel of God's kingdom, including the promised restoration of his covenant people to their calling. They were practical. CMJ set up mission stations throughout the world. Schools, churches, clinics, hospitals, printing presses, bookshops were established primarily in Europe and the Middle East to help alleviate the suffering of the Jewish people. CMJ staff were instrumental in combating anti-Semitism and Christians in the British government, many involved with CMJ, including Wilberforce and Lord Shaftesbury, played a key role in the Jewish return to the Promised Land. CMJ not only built the first Protestant church in the Middle East, Christ Church, Jerusalem, but also the first schools, first houses of industry for job training, the first hospital with state-of-the-art equipment and medicine, all of which helped bring modern standards of health, welfare, and education to Eretz Israel. In August 1840, the Times of London reported that the British government was considering Jewish restoration. An important, though often neglected, figure in British support for the restoration of the Jews was William Heckler, an Anglican clergyman of German descent who was chaplain of the British Embassy in Vienna and became a close friend of Theodor Herzl. Heckler, the Anglican, was instrumental in aiding Herzl through his diplomatic activities and may, in that sense, be called the founder of modern Christian Zionism. Marking the 25th anniversary of the death of Herzl, it was noted by the editors of the English language memorial volume that William Heckler would prove, and I quote, not only the first, but the most constant and most indefatigable of Herzl's followers. Anglicans have both historically and boldly supported the Jewish people and Israel's right to exist. Secondly, biblically and ecclesially, they have offered support. Biblical advocacy for the restoration of the Jews to the covenant land was advocated by many theologians following the Protestant Reformation. John Owen, John Gill, Samuel Rutherford, Charles Wesley, who wrote in 1762, some of you, I trust, will still sing it in your churches. We know it must be done, for God hath spoke the word. All Israel shall their Saviour own, to their first state restored. Rebuilt by his command, Jerusalem shall arise, her temple on Moriah stand again, and touch the skies. Anglican Bishop J.C. Ryle, who is perhaps better known for his work on holiness, the first Anglican Bishop of Liverpool, who died in 1900, clearly taught and believed in the restoration of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. In his work, Coming Events and Present Duties, Ryle wrote, and I quote, Christ will come, Christ will gather the scattered tribes of Israel and place them once more in their own land. As he literally rode upon an ass, was literally sold for 30 pieces of silver, had his hands and feet literally pierced, was numbered literally with transgressors, and had lots cast upon his raiment, and all that Scripture might be fulfilled, so also he will come, literally set up a kingdom, and literally reign over the earth. Ryle and those before him understood the clarity of the biblical narrative, and what Dr. Rudolph so wonderfully expressed to us just earlier. And what is sometimes described as the New Testament's most comprehensive presentation regarding the Jews in Israel, let's reflect again on some of those words of the Apostle Paul in Romans 9 through 11. Did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. Unthinkable, impossible, out of the question, never to do it. Even if they break covenant, God still fully committed to them. Visiting Germany in 1980, Pope John Paul II summarized what many consider the proper Roman Catholic approach to Judaism with his words, and I quote, "Who meets Jesus Christ meets Judaism." And he described the Jews as, again I quote, "the people of God of the Old Covenant, never retracted by God." Again, the biblical narrative is clear. How could Almighty God have finished with Israel? To them belong the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of Torah and the worship and the promises, the patriarch, and from their race according to the flesh is the Mashiach. 3 times in Romans chapter 11, the Apostle Paul rebukes Gentiles for their arrogance and their boasting that they have replaced the Jews. Surely if Paul had not confronted this replacement theology, and if such theology had been allowed to continue in Rome, would there not be 2 churches today, a Jewish and Gentile church? And this would have spread through the whole empire, because all roads lead from Rome as well as to Rome. And in chapter 9, Paul writes that the Jewish people were in the past a selected people. In 10, he says a present people. Yes, stubborn, but present. And then in 11, Paul writes that in the future, a saved people. A clear reference to a future in God. And so, as a Christian, as an Anglican bishop, from the foundation of critical biblical exegesis, the New Testament narrative is clear. I do not believe you can read the Bible, the Hebrew Scriptures, and the New Testament and be in any doubt about this at all. As an Anglican, the biblical narrative alone is sufficient to support the Jewish people and Israel's right to exist. Thirdly, a comment about moral support and long memories. Over the past 100 years, the world has seen unspeakable disasters and suffering. For nearly 1.5 million Armenians who were slaughtered in a genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Empire in 1915. The unthinkable acts of terror perpetrated by Islamic terrorists on September the 11th in our own nation. The beheading of 21 Coptic Christians on the Libyan coast in February this year. However, the Holocaust during World War II, in which approximately 6 million Jews were exterminated in Hitler's final solution, demands in itself the world's support for the creation, existence, protection, and preservation of the Jewish people in the State of Israel. In 1945, the world was brought face to face with the horrific scenes of concentration camps through newsreels and printed media. Nail marks, as some of you know, are still visible in the gas chamber walls where Jews had tried to claw their way out of the suffocating death chamber into which they were herded. After arriving on the trains and inhaling Zyklon B, their lives abruptly ended. Their hair was cut off and used to stuff cushions. If their teeth had gold fillings, they were wrenched out with pliers. If there were any tattoos on their skin, the skin was carefully peeled off and made into lampshades. If there was any fat on their bodies at all, it was taken to make soap, and their bodies incinerated into ash and sold for fertilizer. Some historians suggest that from arriving on the trains to the point where human ash was available as fertilizer took 90 minutes. Speaking of the atrocities against the Jewish people, the Most Reverend William Temple, the 98th Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury, who served during those atrocities in the Second World War, said, and I quote, "My chief protest is against procrastination of any kind. The Jews are being slaughtered at a rate of tens of thousands a day on many days. It is always true that the obligations of decent men are decided for them by the contingencies which they did not themselves create, and very largely by the actions of wicked men." He continued, "The priest and the Levite in the parable were not in the least responsible for the traveller's wounds as he lay there on the roadside, and no doubt they had many other pressing things to attend to. But they stand as a picture of those who are condemned for neglecting the opportunity to show mercy. We at this moment have a tremendous responsibility. We stand at the bar of history, humanity, and of God," he said. In contrast to that courageous and prophetic word from Archbishop Temple, much of the Anglican Church in the West has largely been silent over the horrific atrocities directed against the Jewish people in the State of Israel. Very sadly and inexcusably, even Anglican bishops have been perpetrators of this evil. In 1969, Elias Cowrie, an Anglican priest from Ramallah, the dean of the Anglican Cathedral of St. George the Martyr in Jerusalem, was caught and convicted by Israeli authorities for having transported explosive devices in a medical chest placed inside his car. The explosives were used by the Islamic terrorist group, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, at the British consulate in Jerusalem and at a supermarket, resulting in the deaths of 2 people and causing the injuries of 11 others. In a deal with authorities, Cowrie was allowed to emigrate to Jordan, where he was rewarded for his actions by being made Anglican Bishop of Amman. Such actions are outrageous and indefensible at every level. I believe that every Christian has a responsibility to neutralize the most dreadful persecution there has been over the past 2,000 years against God's people. Some of you will have visited Bet Hatshepsut, the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv. There is a statue, or there was at one time a statue of a woman, triumphant, strong, and beautiful, representing the Christian church, and by her side is a cringing, poor, thin, terrified statue of a woman representing the Jewish people. The statue tragically depicts the anti-Semitic attitude of much of Christian history towards the Jewish people and Israel. Jewish people have long memories because their history is long. But let me say at this juncture, the moral foundation for my support for Israel does not in any way, and should not in any way, be seen as a basis for excusing injustice and any human rights abuses that may be perpetrated by the modern state of Israel towards Palestinians or any other ethnic minority. However, I do believe that every nation has the right to defend herself, its people, borders, and the right of every individual to freely choose and change their religious affiliation. 2,000 years of anti-Semitism will only be undergone by a generation of Christians who declare their solidarity and support of the right of Israel to exist in the world by confronting immoral, unbiblical, and anti-Semitic policies of governments, administrations, presidents, prime ministers, churches, and Israel and individuals. Again, the words of Archbishop Temple, my chief protest is against procrastination of any kind. And then finally, personal support. A bishop's final word. I'm a disciple of Yeshua, the Messiah. I am convinced that what Jesus said, recorded in the Gospels of the New Testament, is the word of Almighty God. I'm convinced of it. Jesus himself said salvation is from the Jews. In Christ, I am grafted into them, not them into me. It was a Jewish woman who nurtured and cared for my Jewish Messiah. It was the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints from the apostles, Jewish apostles, that the church continues to declare and defend to this day. It is to the land of Israel, to which he called the city of the great king, to which Jesus will make his second advent. Not to Canterbury. Listen, Anglicans. Not to Canterbury, but to Jerusalem. And so to conclude, you'd expect me, no doubt, to conclude with an Anglican bishop again, J.C. Ryle, writing about these events, who said, and I quote, denial of the literal ingathering of the Jewish nation and their restoration to their own land, writes Ryle, is as astonishing and incomprehensible to my own mind as the denial of the divinity of Christ. Not bad from an Anglican, huh? Historical, biblical, moral, personal. Bishop Neil and I, amongst others, are Anglican bishops who support and defend the Jewish people, their right to exist in the state of Israel. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shechianu v'kimanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has given us life, preserved us, and brought us to this occasion today. God bless you.
Any questions for Bishop Dobbs? Much to absorb. Yes.
Yes, I'm Dan from Dan Altaras from Dallas Theological Seminary. I was wondering if there's any expectancy for a Jewish bishop in Jerusalem anytime soon.
Such matters are always matters for prayer. And Bishop Neil Labar, who is with me today, has extensive involvement in the land and with Anglicans in the land. And we must pray for the Anglican Church, not just for Christ Church, but for every expression of the Anglican Church in the land of Israel, where there is much need for God's grace and much transformation required theologically and practically over these matters.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'm Bill Adams with Bridges for Peace out of Florida, Orlando area. Such a rich heritage of Anglican involvement in the return to Zion, the communication of it, the teaching, the practical help, and then a move away. What accounts for that departure from biblical Zionism, and then what is there something in that that could be the key to understanding a restoration, even of the Anglican Church's role in the building up of Zion?
Yes, thank you. I made an endeavor to emphasize, obviously, the initial engagement of many Anglicans in the return to Zion and the great theological basis, along with the practical engagement of the Anglican Church. Much of the Western world within Anglicanism takes its cue from the Church of England, and political developments within the United Kingdom, which have caused the state Church of England to become less than supportive for many years of Israel and the Jewish people, eventually find their way into other portions and parts of the Anglican world, particularly in the West. And therefore, nations such as ours, New Zealand, where I hail from originally, become very hostile towards both a biblical but also a political position that offers any support to Israel at all. And so that, I believe, is one of the main factors that has caused the Anglican Church to depart from its biblical heritage and engagement with the land of Israel and the Jewish people. I would want to underscore, though, that the largest provinces of the Anglican Communion today, primarily the provinces in Africa, the Church of Nigeria, 18 to 20 million Anglicans in church on a Sunday morning, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda. Many of those nations, particularly the Nigerians, are very vocally and publicly supportive of the Jewish people and the land of Israel. And you will find within evangelical Anglicanism, within the GAFCOM movement, our new expression of global Anglicanism, a greater understanding of these issues that we're discussing today. So there is hope for the Anglican world with regards to its understanding of Israel and the Jewish people.
Anybody else? Yes.
Can you speak to the current Archbishop's position on Israel and support for her?
I'm unaware of any numerous statements that have been made by the current Archbishop of Canterbury. Bishop Neil, are you aware? Can you speak to that?
He, as you may know, has something of a Jewish background himself that he discovered in adulthood. The only thing I'm aware of is that he made a strong statement against anti-Semitism after the Paris attacks. It was very clear. And he was also supportive of the reprimand of Stephen Sicer that took place along with the reprimands of others. But he was part of that process.
Any other questions, comments, or provocations? Well, with that, we will close our lunch session, and the next session and panel is not until 2 o'clock. So, Jerry, shall we just have some break time? You all actually will be allowed to converse among each other and to relax, and we'll see you back here at 2 p.m. sharp.